4th, 2012, 34-year-old Eric Samoa stood between two brand-new Jaguar cars on the showroom floor of a luxury car dealership in Bethesda, Maryland. Eric was talking to a potential new car buyer. Eric was this dealership's top salesperson, sometimes pulling in between $10,000 and $20,000 in commission checks every month. Eric was very handsome. He wore a well-fitted black suit and a red tie, and he was tall with a shaved head, brown eyes, and a goatee. Eric smiled at his potential customer, told him a joke, and then put his hand on the guy's shoulder like they were old friends. But pretty quickly, Eric sensed this guy was not actually ready to buy a car just yet. Still though, Eric had not become the top salesperson at this dealership by giving up at the first sign that the customer is not fully committed. Instead, Eric just continued talking and listening to the guy, doing his best to establish a real connection. That way, when this guy came back and was ready to buy a car, he would hopefully come back to Eric. The potential customer walked around one of the Jaguars and told Eric he would definitely think about buying it. He said he loved how it looked, he just needed to talk to his wife first. Eric said he totally understood, and then he handed the guy his business card and walked him out of the showroom and said he looked forward to meeting with him again. Then Eric turned and walked back across the showroom floor, past all the polished, perfectly lit cars, into a bright carpeted hallway that led to the break room and a few offices. Eric walked into his manager's office and said he was taking off for the day. His manager told him to have a good night, and Eric just grinned, because he definitely had a good night planned, and he couldn't wait to get it started. About 15 minutes later, Eric pulled into the parking lot of his high-rise luxury apartment building in Silver City, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. The apartment building was the type of place that catered to young professionals, with a rooftop pool and plenty of bars and restaurants within walking distance. Eric walked into the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor, where his place was. Once inside his apartment, he went right to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. Then he headed to his bedroom and changed into black jeans and a black t-shirt, and then he walked out onto a small balcony. He left the door open behind him. Out on his balcony, Eric sipped his drink as he watched the local restaurants and bars down below come to life. Eric loved this part of town, and he loved his apartment, especially because he'd had to work so hard to be able to afford it. Eric was the youngest of 4 children born to immigrant parents from Ghana. And when Eric and his siblings were kids, their parents had told them that the United States was filled with opportunity, and that in the United States, they could be anything they wanted as long as they worked really hard. So Eric had grown up basically believing the American dream was true, that if he put in the work, he would be successful. And looking out from his balcony inside of his upscale neighborhood, Eric felt like he was definitely on the right path. Selling luxury cars had really paid off. He made great money, and he had no intention of slowing down. Just then, Eric heard a knock at his door. He turned around and walked through his apartment and put his glass down on the coffee table, then opened up the front door and saw a 34-year-old Katrina Ben standing there. Katrina smiled, got up on her toes, and threw her arms around Eric's neck and gave Eric a big kiss. Then they both went inside, and Katrina curled up on the brown leather couch in front of the TV, and Eric went to the kitchen to pour Katrina a glass of wine, and then he joined her on the couch. Eric and Katrina had been seeing each other for a few months, but they were still keeping things really casual. They had met outside of the apartment building and discovered right away they had a lot in common. Katrina shared Eric's really strong work ethic, and it's what allowed her to become a nurse. They also both loved basketball, and so their relationship consisted of basically hanging out a couple of times a week, watching a basketball game together, and then spending the night together. And that night in particular, they were both really excited because there was this big NBA playoff game on. And so, sitting on the couch, Eric and Katrina talked about who they thought was going to win the game, and then they also talked about how their jobs were going. But Eric looked a bit distracted. He kept picking up his phone and checking the time. Finally, he just turned and asked Katrina if she was up for going on a quick ride before the game started. Katrina figured he just wanted to go out and maybe pick up some food or something, but no, Eric told her he actually wanted to go meet a guy who he could buy marijuana from. He said the guy lived close and it wouldn't take very long. Katrina was surprised. She knew Eric occasionally smoked weed, but he'd never asked her to go buy weed with him. Still, she figured it wasn't that big of a deal. They were in a really nice suburb, so how dangerous could this weed dealer really be? So Katrina told him that was fine, as long as they got back in time for the start of the game. Eric promised they wouldn't miss a thing. Then he and Katrina left the apartment, went down the elevator, and out to Eric's car. After driving for a few minutes, Eric turned onto a side street in front of a small apartment complex, and he pulled over to the curb and put his car in park. To Katrina, the street seemed totally empty, but suddenly the back driver's side door opened, and this tall, skinny-looking drug dealer with a scraggly beard slid into the back seat. The dealer quickly handed a paper bag over the seat to Eric, and Eric took the bag, he looked inside, and he saw a Ziploc baggie of marijuana, and after he was satisfied, he handed the cash back to the dealer. The dealer then hopped out of the car without a word, closed the door, and disappeared back into the apartment complex. The entire exchange took less than a minute. Eric turned and smiled at Katrina, and then he turned the car back on, and he drove them back to his place just in time to watch the opening tip-off of the playoff game. And then later that night, after the game was over, Eric and Katrina went to bed together. Then, right before Katrina actually went to sleep, she reminded Eric that she had to work early the next day, so pretty likely when he woke up in the morning, she'd be gone. Eric said he totally remembered, then he kissed Katrina goodnight, and the couple rolled over and they both drifted off to sleep. And hours later, in the early morning of June 5th, 2012, Eric was still asleep in his bed when somebody walked into his bedroom, walked across the floor, and stood right beside him, staring down at him as he slept. The following day, so June 6th, Eric's manager at the luxury car dealership sat in his office trying to get a hold of Eric on the phone. Eric was supposed to work that day, but he hadn't shown up, and his phone kept going to voicemail. Top salespeople like Eric occasionally took what everybody at the dealership called unscheduled days off, but Eric always made sure to let his manager know if he wasn't going to come in, and he hadn't on this day. So the manager walked to the showroom floor and talked to a couple of other salespeople, but none of them had heard from Eric either. The manager started to get worried, so he went back to his office and he called Eric's emergency contact, who was one of his older sisters. The manager told Eric's sister he didn't want to upset her, but he hadn't seen or heard from Eric that day. Eric's sister was totally frightened by this, and she immediately called Eric, and when he didn't answer, she called her other sister and her other brother to see if they had heard from him. But they too had not talked to Eric in at least a couple of days. Eric's sister, the one who the car dealership manager had called, had a really uneasy feeling. Eric talked or texted with at least one of his siblings every single day. And so Eric's sister felt like, this was an actual emergency, and so she took a deep breath and dialed 911. After explaining what was going on with Eric, the 911 operator said that police would send officers by Eric's apartment to do a wellness check on him. Eric's sister thanked the dispatcher, and then she went right to her car and raced across town to Eric's apartment building. A little before 5 p.m., Eric's sister waited downstairs in the apartment complex lobby while a building manager led 2 police officers up to Eric's apartment on the 6th floor. One of the officers knocked on Eric's door but got no response, so the building manager unlocked the door and stepped back. At that point, the officers stepped forward, walked inside, and began calling out to see if anybody was home, but again, there was no answer. So the officers walked across the apartment, down a short hallway, and came to a closed bedroom door. One of the officers knocked, but there was still no answer, so they opened up the door and walked inside. And there was Eric laying in bed. There was a sheet that was pulled up all the way up to his mouth. The officers walked over, and they saw there was a single gunshot wound to Eric's head. Both officers thought it looked like Eric Samoa had taken his own life. The officers quickly went back downstairs, and when they got there, one of them placed his hand on Eric's sister's shoulder. He said he was so sorry, but they had found her brother deceased upstairs in his bed. Eric's sister let out a shriek that echoed off the lobby walls. She started wailing and crying. She could not believe her little brother was gone. About 45 minutes after Eric's body was discovered, Detective Dmitry Ruvin of the Montgomery County Police Department walked into the lobby of Eric's apartment building. He saw officers standing with 2 women and a man who were huddled together and crying. Ruvin was one of the youngest detectives on the force, but he did have experience, and other cops basically envied him for his seemingly boundless energy. He waved one of the officers over, and the officer told him the people in the lobby were Eric's siblings. Reuven asked the officer to let them know that he would be down shortly to talk to them. Then Reuven quickly walked across the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor. Reuven walked through Eric's apartment, and he understood why the first officers on the scene had thought Eric killed himself. The door to the apartment had been locked when they arrived, and there was no sign of forced entry, and expensive items like Eric's computer and TV had been left untouched, so this didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Reuven stepped into the bedroom, and he saw that Eric had a single bullet wound in his head, another sign of a possible suicide. But Reuven searched the entire bedroom and didn't find a gun, so he knew the officers had been wrong. There was no way Eric had shot himself. Someone clearly had shot him. Reuven looked down at Eric's body, and for whatever reason, he felt this instant connection with the guy. He couldn't really explain it. He'd worked a lot of homicide cases, and he always felt sympathy for the victims. But this was something different. This was more personal. Reuven told himself that the reason for this connection must just be because Eric looked to be about the same age as Reuven. It was like, here's this guy with every opportunity in front of him, and somebody took that away from him. And this just made Reuven really upset and angry. It just seemed so wrong. Reuven took out his phone and called the station to let his boss know that this was a homicide, not a suicide, and so he would need an investigative team sent over. And not long after that call, forensics analysts arrived at Eric's apartment and began sweeping through it. And they would discover a single .380 caliber bullet casing in the bedroom, but there still was no sign of a gun anywhere. They also did a sweep of the apartment for fingerprints and possible DNA samples, but they knew that type of evidence might not get them very far in this case. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of struggle meant there was a good chance Eric knew his killer. So the analysts figured they would just find lots of prints of friends or family who were often at Eric's place and so were not suspicious. And any of them could be guilty. And Reuven knew right now 3 of Eric's family members, his sisters and brother, were down in the lobby waiting to talk to him. So Reuven let the forensics team continue their work, and then he headed back downstairs. The elevator doors opened, and Reuven could hear Eric's siblings still crying in the lobby. Reuven walked slowly now, and he heard the sound of his shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He hated this part of the job. Eric's siblings only knew that their brother had been found dead in his apartment. They didn't know what happened. So Reuven lowered his head and approached them, and he told them he was so sorry, but their brother had actually been murdered. That sent Eric's brother and sisters into another fit of screaming. Detective Reuven stood with them and let them get as loud and as angry as they wanted. Then eventually, one of Eric's sisters caught her breath and wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked right at Reuven, and she told him he needed to speak with a woman named Denise Harrington. Reuven asked who Denise was. Eric's sister said Denise was Eric's girlfriend, and she was no good. She was 20 years older than Eric, and his entire family knew Denise was just using Eric for his money. Reuven thanked Eric's siblings for their time, and he said police would follow up with them soon. Then he offered his condolences again and headed back upstairs. When he got there, he could tell, after hours and hours of searching this apartment, really the only thing investigators had found so far was just that bullet casing. But Reuven felt like this Denise person was a really strong lead, and so it didn't really matter right now that they didn't have much evidence. So Reuven found the phone number for Eric's girlfriend, Denise, gave her a call, and when she picked up, he told her he needed to meet with her to ask some questions about her boyfriend. The day after Eric's body was discovered, members of Reuven's team re-interviewed Eric's brother and sisters and looked into other family members who might have spent time at Eric's apartment. But Reuven himself remained focused on Eric's girlfriend, Denise. At the station, he led Denise into an interview room, sat across from her at a small wooden table, and handed her a bottle of water. He thanked Denise for coming in, and then asked her if she understood why she was there. And she just said, I understand there's some questions about Eric. Reuven nodded, and then asked her very gently if she knew that Eric had been killed. A look of total shock came across Denise's face, and she just began shaking her head, no, and then just said she couldn't believe it. People loved Eric. Reuven watched Denise very closely. She looked genuinely surprised and upset about this news, but he knew some people were naturally just very good actors. Looking at Denise now, it also struck Reuven how big the age gap was between her and Eric. Eric's family clearly had not approved of a woman 20 years older dating their little brother, but Reuven did not think being older than Eric somehow made Denise more suspicious. Reuven asked Denise if it was strange that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in the last couple of days, before he was killed, but she told him it was not strange that she hadn't heard from Eric because Eric was actually not her boyfriend. Not anymore, anyways. Reuven was confused. Eric's siblings seemed very certain that Denise was seeing Eric and using Eric as far as they were concerned, but Denise explained that she and Eric had hit a rough patch about a month earlier. She found out he was obviously cheating on her when she noticed text messages coming into his phone from 2 other women. And so Denise just did not want to be treated that way, and so she had ended it with Eric, like their relationship was done and she had not talked to him in a while. And Denise said, if somebody close to Eric thought that she, Denise, and Eric were still together, it was probably only because Eric had not told anybody about the breakup. Denise felt like, Eric likely wanted his family to think he was settling down and not still going out and seeing a bunch of different women at the same time. Finally, Reuven asked Denise where she was on the night of the murder, and she said she'd been at home and said police could check her phone records that would prove she was telling the truth. Reuven thanked her for her cooperation and said he would be taking her phone now so they could download the information to help corroborate her alibi. And a little later that day, after police had finished downloading the information from her phone, Reuven gave the phone back and let Denise go. And while Reuven did think Denise was genuinely shocked when she heard the news about Eric, he couldn't help but think, Denise had a clear motive to want to harm Eric. Eric was cheating on her, and a jilted lover almost always had to be considered a viable suspect. But for now, Reuven would just have to wait until his team went through all of that information downloaded off Denise's phone to figure out if she really was a viable suspect. So in the meantime, Reuven headed back up to the 6th floor of Eric's apartment building to talk to some of Eric's neighbors. Reuven knocked on a door that was nearby Eric's apartment, and a guy in his 20s answered. The young man did not look surprised to see a detective standing there. He said he knew Eric pretty well, and he knew Eric had been killed. Then, without being prompted, he told Reuven the police should really question Eric's girlfriend. Reuven said he'd already met with Denise, but the young man just kind of stared at him, and then he said no, Eric's girlfriend's name was not Denise, it was Katrina. If you recall, Katrina was the woman who watched basketball with him on the night he was killed. The neighbor told Reuven that Katrina lived in the apartment building, and he had seen Eric with Katrina a bunch of times. Reuven thanked the young man for his help, and then the door shut, and then Reuven just stood there in the hall thinking. Denise had mentioned during her interview that 2 women had been texting Eric, which is how she had figured out he was cheating on her, but neither of those 2 women were named Katrina. And Eric's family had never mentioned anybody named Katrina at all. And so now, Reuven thought he might have a jilted lover in Denise and a secret lover in Katrina to consider as suspects. Reuven really wanted to make sure he was fully prepared before he brought in Katrina for an interview, so he and his team did some digging. They found out Katrina was from Mississippi, and she had come to Maryland a few months earlier to work as a nurse for the National Institutes of Health, a government organization focused on public health research. But much more important than that, at least to Detective Reuven, was that several people in the apartment building saw Eric and Katrina together on the night before Eric was killed. A couple of days after Eric was killed, Detective Reuven found himself back in an interview room talking to a woman he thought was Eric's girlfriend. And just like he had done with Denise, he started the interview by asking Katrina if she knew why she was there. And Katrina, who had a sort of confused look on her face, told him that, she understood she was here to help with some investigation, but she hadn't been given any more details than that. She figured it might have something to do with where she worked, but she didn't know. At this point, Reuven told her point blank that her boyfriend, Eric, had been found murdered in his apartment, and that she was the last person anybody had seen him with. Immediately, a look of complete disbelief came across her face, and as she pulled her legs up onto her seat and grabbed her knees with her arms and began rocking back and forth, she began saying to Reuven that, why would anybody want to do this? Everybody loves Eric. And then she asked Reuven, is it possible that this was not Eric? But Reuven said no, this was definitely Eric, and he is definitely deceased. At this, Katrina clutched her knees even tighter, and then she looked up at Reuven with a very sad look on her face, and she said, she just felt so guilty. For the past couple of days, she'd been furious at Eric because he had not been responding to any of her text messages. And so she thought he was just being a jerk for some reason, but now she knew why he wasn't responding. It was because he was dead. That realization was like too much for Katrina to handle, and for a minute, it seemed like she might have a total breakdown. But then she stopped rocking in her chair, and she put her feet on the floor, and she leaned forward. It was like something had just clicked in her mind. She told Reuven that something really strange had happened on that last night that she was with Eric. Reuven leaned in and asked Katrina to please walk him through everything she could remember about that night. Katrina took a deep breath, and then she began speaking. She said she and Eric had met up to watch basketball, but they left his apartment so Eric could go buy some weed. Then, after Eric got his weed, the couple went back to Eric's apartment, they watched the game, they had sex, and then they went to sleep. None of this seemed very out of the ordinary to Reuven, and he was about to say as much, but Katrina said, hold on, the weird part happened the next morning. She said the next morning when she woke up around 5 a.m., because she had to get up really early for work, she had looked over and Eric was not in the bed. Then she heard voices coming from some other room. She thought maybe Eric was on the phone, so she just got dressed, grabbed her things, and walked out of the bedroom, and the drug dealer who had sold Eric the marijuana the night before was standing right there. Katrina said this totally freaked her out. Doing, a quick weed deal in the car was one thing, but having a drug dealer in the apartment at 5 a.m. seemed wrong to her. And being a nurse for a government organization, she did not want to be associated with any drug dealers. But that wasn't all. Katrina said when she looked at this dealer, this tall, skinny guy with a scraggly beard, he seemed really agitated. And when Katrina told Eric she was leaving, the dealer turned and looked at her and walked over, grabbed her arm, and basically rushed her out of the apartment and then shut the door behind her. Reuven got Katrina to give him as many details as she could about the dealer and about the location where he had sold Eric marijuana the night before. And after taking all that down, Reuven stopped for a second because he thought of something. He asked Katrina, why didn't you check in on Eric later in the day or really at any point over the next couple of days when he wasn't responding to her text messages? Like the last thing you saw was Eric alone in his apartment with this sketchy drug dealer who rushes you out the door and shuts the door behind you. You said the drug dealer seemed agitated, so what? You just figured everything was fine and you just didn't think to follow up? Katrina could see how suspicious it seemed, but she explained to Reuven that her relationship with Eric was very casual. They basically were not a girlfriend and boyfriend, they were not a couple, they were just kind of hooking up periodically, and that was it. And so Katrina said, she just was worried that if she really aggressively followed up trying to get in touch with Eric and, went over to his place to check on him, that might come off to Eric like she was this really obsessed girlfriend, and she just didn't want that. And then over the course of a couple of days, when Eric did not get in touch with her, she got mad at him. Why is he not getting in touch with her? And so it just kind of led to this silence. Reuven nodded and then thanked Katrina for coming in and told her he would be in touch if he needed more information from her. Not long after Katrina left, Reuven's team worked to track down that drug dealer. And with Katrina's description of him and the exact location of where Eric purchased that marijuana from him, it didn't take them very long to find this guy. His name was William Woodfork, and he quickly became the focus of Reuven's investigation. A couple of days after the interview with Katrina, Reuven sat back down inside the interview room with William Woodfork. William was tall and lanky with a patchy beard, just like Katrina had described, and he was very, very nervous seeming. He was having a really hard time sitting still. Police had not told William why he was here, and so Reuven figured William was likely very worried about getting busted for dealing drugs. But Reuven acted like he didn't notice, and he just casually reached into a folder and pulled out a photo of Eric, and he placed it on the table in front of William, and he said to William, "This man right here in this photo is a guy named Eric, and he was just murdered." And then Reuven asked William, "How long have you known Eric?" William looked down at the photo, and after staring for a second, he just shook his head and said he'd never met the guy. Reuven smiled a very knowing smile and then told William it was not a good idea to be lying to the police. This is a homicide investigation. This is about as serious as it gets. Reuven told William he had Eric's phone records, so he knew William had texted Eric the night before Eric got murdered. Immediately, William hung his head and stared at the floor and then began backtracking. He admitted to Reuven that actually he had sold Eric weed a few times, including on that past Monday night. At this point, Reuben stopped smiling, and he immediately asked William, "Okay, fine, you sold him weed on Monday. Why did you go to Eric's apartment early on Tuesday morning at around 5 a.m.? William immediately looked up and told Reuben he was not some big-time drug dealer out settling scores. He's like, "I had nothing to do with Eric getting killed." But Reuben was not about to take the word of someone who had literally just lied to his face. And with the phone records and William admitting he saw Eric the night before the murder, Reuben felt like he had more than enough evidence to pursue this lead further. So, not long after that meeting, Reuben secured a warrant to search William's apartment. And when they did search his apartment in the week following Eric's murder, police would find a .380 caliber handgun, the same type of handgun that had been used to kill Eric. And so Detective Reuben was pretty much positive he had just found Eric's killer. But later that week, when the ballistics report on Williams' gun came back, it showed the ammunition used in his gun did not match the bullet casing that was found in Eric's bedroom, meaning this gun was not the murder weapon. Reuben was not willing to totally eliminate William as a suspect. It just seemed too coincidental that this guy would happen to have a .380 caliber handgun in his apartment, but it could be just a bizarre coincidence. And without more compelling evidence, he knew any case brought against William would not hold up in court. And so suddenly, Reuben felt like this investigation had just stalled in a major way. Investigators went from believing they had their killer right back to having no idea who they were even looking for. And at the same time, Reuben began getting daily calls from Eric's sisters, but he had no new information to share with them. And Reuben told other investigators that he felt like he was letting Eric's family down. Weeks passed without any new leads coming in, and then several months went by, and pretty soon this case became much less of a priority for the department. But Reuben refused to let the case just go cold. In fact, he put a photo of Eric on his desk to remind him of the job he still needed to do. And he continued to talk to Eric's sisters almost every day, and he promised them as long as he was on the force, he would never stop looking for their brother's killer. In May of 2013, almost a year after Eric's murder, Detective Reuben continued his investigation. But almost no new evidence had surfaced, and so he was basically running out of ideas. Reuben pored over Eric's case files whenever he could, looking for anything that he might have just overlooked. And there was one piece of evidence, or really a missing piece of evidence, that had always bothered him. The gun that had been used to kill Eric had never been found. So now, Reuben decided to try something he knew was a total long shot, but he felt like he had nothing to lose. Police often confiscated guns as evidence in investigations, and they occasionally received guns that people had simply found and turned into them. So, Reuben reached out to every police department in the county and asked for a list of all the .380 caliber handguns they had received in the past year, either confiscated as evidence or turned into them by a Good Samaritan. The other departments all cooperated, and soon Reuben ended up with this list of 60 .380 caliber handguns. And then Reuben began the painstaking work of tracking down the history of each of those 60 guns. And the first 58 guns led him nowhere. But when he began looking into the 59th gun on the list, he thought he might have found something promising. That gun had been found discarded on the side of the road on the Capitol Beltway, one of the busiest streets in Washington, D.C. The man who had handed this gun over to police had been sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic and just happened to look over and see the gun lying on the side of the road. And that spot on the Beltway was not very far from Eric's apartment. But there was another detail in this report about this 59th gun that gave Reuben the biggest jolt of energy he'd felt in almost a year. The man who found this gun had found it just 2 days after Eric's murder. Using the 59th gun's serial number, Detective Reuben tracked down the weapon's original owner, but that man told Reuben he'd actually sold the gun at a pawn shop years earlier, and so Reuben found that pawn shop and got their sales records for the gun, and from there, Reuben started tracking down every one of the gun's previous owners, and there were quite a few of them. And this process dragged on for weeks and weeks, but finally, right around the actual 1-year anniversary of Eric's death, Reuben talked to a man who had sold this 59th gun to a pawn shop just a few months before Eric was killed. And so Reuben felt like there was a legitimate chance that whoever had bought the gun from this latest pawn shop was the killer. Now, the pawn shop was nowhere near Reuben's police station, but he decided he would take a trip there, hoping all of his work would pay off. So, on a hot and humid June day, Detective Reuben, along with several other officers, walked into the pawn shop on the outskirts of a small rural town. Reuben thought it was the kind of place someone would never find unless they already knew it existed. The pawn shop owner greeted Reuben from behind the counter in a very thick southern drawl, and he asked how he could help. Reuben told the owner he was looking for sales records on a particular gun, and then he gave the owner the serial number of the gun. But the owner right away just sighed and said he was really sorry, but he couldn't do that. He'd stored those sales records in diaper boxes out in a shed behind the shop, and earlier that year, rats had gotten into the shed and started gnawing away at all the diaper boxes. The owner was worried he would lose the records to the rats, and he knew losing gun sale records could get him in big trouble with the federal government, so he handed over all those records inside of the chewed-up diaper boxes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF. The ATF is a United States government agency that primarily monitors firearms trafficking. Reuben just stood there and stared at the pawn shop owner. He felt like laughing at how absurd this was. He never imagined diaper boxes and rats would play a role in his homicide investigation, but here he was. And so ultimately, Reuben thanked the owner and then left the pawn shop and headed back to Montgomery County, Maryland, to the police station. And once he got there, he called an ATF agent that he knew and told him what had happened. Reuben offered to go to ATF storage and personally dig through all the chewed-up diaper boxes himself, but the agent assured him the ATF would find whatever he needed. And on June 12, 2013, so over a year after Eric's murder, Reuben got a call at his desk from that ATF agent. And the agent told Reuben that they had just tracked down all those diaper boxes, and they had found the specific report Reuben was looking for, and so he was faxing the report over right now. Reuben thanked the agent and hung up the phone, but as soon as he did, he felt so nervous. It was like every muscle in his body was getting tense. He knew if this report that he was about to read didn't give him any new information, he would have no idea what to do next. And so as he was thinking about this, he looked over at the photo of Eric on his desk and just held his breath. The fax machine near his desk started printing out the report. Reuben got up, walked over to the machine, grabbed the report, and began to read through it. And as he did, Reuben felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. After more than a year of investigating this case and weeks of tracking down gun owners all over the place, Reuben knew, based on this report, that he could call Eric's siblings right now and tell them he had found their brother's killer. Based on records from the ATF and evidence collected over the course of a year, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Samoa in the early morning hours of June 5th, 2012. The killer was standing at the foot of Eric's bed, watching him sleep. They'd been standing there for a few minutes, just staring, but they knew now it was time to act. So they reached into their bag that was slung over their shoulder and pulled out a .380 caliber handgun. The killer then walked forward until they were right next to Eric, trying to be as quiet as possible. They didn't know what Eric would do if he suddenly woke up. And so at this point, the killer kind of leaned over Eric until they were so close to him, they could actually feel Eric's breath on their cheek. Then they slowly pulled up their gun and aimed it basically point blank at Eric's forehead, and then they fired. The bullet lodged inside of Eric's brain, and he died without ever waking up. The killer quickly tossed the gun into their bag and then pulled the bedsheet up to Eric's mouth to try to cover up some of the blood. Then the killer ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them. They opened up the front door, they locked the doorknob, and then closed it, and then they ran down the hallway to the elevator. As the elevator was making its way down, the killer took several steadying breaths, doing their best to look as calm as possible. When the elevator doors opened, the killer walked across the lobby, went out to the parking lot, got in their car, and began driving towards Washington, D.C. Now, it was still dark out, and the killer saw headlights up ahead from a line of cars driving towards the city, and so since they didn't want to get caught in traffic, the killer just hit the gas and whipped down the road. The killer reached the Capitol Beltway in D.C. before traffic got too bad, and at this point, they rolled their window down, reached into their bag in the passenger seat, grabbed the murder weapon, and threw it out the window. The first chance they had, the killer turned around and sped back across the Maryland border. About 30 minutes after fleeing Eric's apartment, the killer walked back into Eric's apartment building, except this time, when they got in the elevator, they did not go up to the 6th floor. They went up to a lower floor. And then once they got to that floor, they got out of the elevator, walked down the hall, and went inside of their own apartment. And once they were inside, they showered, put on a nurse's uniform, and went right back downstairs to go to work. Katrina Benn, Eric's basketball-loving, casual romantic partner, was Eric's killer. It would turn out Katrina wanted a lot more out of her relationship with Eric. She did not like the idea of it being casual. And the week before the murder, Eric had blown off Katrina on a night they were supposed to hook up. Katrina knew Eric was out with actually another woman, and she told him she was not okay with that. But Eric was just not ready to be in a fully committed relationship with Katrina. In fact, he didn't even want his family to meet her. So Katrina started to feel like Eric was only using her for sex, and it made her really angry. So angry that she decided she would kill him. When Katrina first arrived at Eric's apartment to watch the basketball game, she had the gun with her, but she just wasn't sure if this night was going to be the night that she actually followed through. But Eric's impromptu drug deal gave Katrina potential cover. She could make up a story and say the dealer had shown up at Eric's apartment and seemed really suspicious, and basically make it seem like the drug dealer had killed Eric. However, the dealer, William Woodfork, had nothing to do with the murder. He had never even been to Eric's apartment. It took Detective Reuven tracking down the gun that was used to kill Eric and delving into the gun's history to finally discover Katrina was the killer, because he had traced the gun back to a pawn shop in a small rural town in Mississippi that just happened to be Katrina's hometown. Now, at this point, Reuven was very sure Katrina was the killer. However, he needed a receipt that showed she was the one who bought this gun last. But when he went to the pawn shop in Mississippi, those sales records were in that shed getting destroyed by rats, and so they had been shipped to the ATF. But Reuven was able to get those records from the ATF, and as soon as he looked through them, he saw right there Katrina's name was on the record. She had bought the murder weapon. She definitely was the killer. And so Katrina would be arrested at her parents' house in Mississippi, and she would be found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 20 years with no chance for parole. To this day, Eric's family say it was Reuven's patience and determination that ultimately got justice for their little brother and gave the family some sense of closure. On Sunday, January 13th, 2008, Rhonda Smith sat in the back pew of the historic Trinity Lutheran Church in tiny Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, doing her best to try to stay calm. The 42-year-old choir singer knew that her pastor, Greg Shreves, would soon call her up to the pulpit to speak, so she was keeping a close eye on him, waiting for his signal. The winter sun streamed in through the stained glass windows of the 18th century sanctuary, and the rays caught the minister's beautiful pale blue eyes. And when this happened, Rhonda noticed, and right away she couldn't help but think to herself how unbelievably handsome the minister really was. At age 56, Shreves was an unlikely minister. He had spent decades as a country club golf pro and official on the professional golf tour before answering God's call in 2005. Shreves was more than 6 feet tall and very fit, and he had blonde hair that was still visible amongst his grays. And he was single. Now, Rhonda was not romantically involved with her minister. To her mind, it was just more of an intimate friendship. But she was deeply touched by everything the minister had done for her. On this particular Sunday, as Rhonda sat nervously in the pew, Pastor Shreves announced that a fundraising campaign he had launched to help Rhonda with her expenses had brought in $3,000. Then Pastor Shreves gave the signal to Rhonda for her to come up and say a few words. And so when Rhonda stood up and began walking towards the pulpit, the 100 or so people in the pews immediately began to applaud and cheer as she walked towards the front. By the time Rhonda was standing at the pulpit next to Pastor Shreves, she was totally embarrassed, but also very touched. Rhonda had actually asked Pastor Shreves for this opportunity to thank the whole congregation, but now that she was actually up there, she was shaking with anxiety. She looked over at Pastor Shreves, who nodded warmly to her, as if to say, "You can do this." So Rhonda took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. She would tell the members of the church that in the 2 years since she had been attending Trinity Lutheran, she had felt welcomed with open arms. This really felt like her home. Rhonda's voice broke as she admitted to the struggles in her life, struggles that many in the congregation already knew about. Rhonda was unable to work full-time because of her battles with mental illness, which had driven her at times to thoughts of suicide. She had been in danger of being evicted from her apartment because she couldn't afford her bills when Pastor Shreve stepped in and began raising money for her. Rhonda tearfully said she owed a debt of gratitude to everyone in the sanctuary as she looked out at all the beaming faces. Out in the crowd was Judy Zellner, a 60-year-old grandmother who was Rhonda's best friend at church. Judy had actually introduced herself to Rhonda on the very first day that Rhonda had shown up at Trinity. And in no time, they were having lunches together like old pals. There was also Mary Jane Fonder, who was also out in the pews, and she was a singer in the choir with Rhonda. Mary Jane was 65 years old and very eccentric. She often wore a wig, sometimes backwards, but she was so kind. One time, when Rhonda was not feeling very well, Mary Jane had baked her a blueberry pie as a way to cheer her up. And of course, there was Pastor Shreve standing right next to Rhonda, who had taken Rhonda under his wing and even offered her temporary work in the church office. Rhonda had never met a man that was so caring and loving. To close out her speech, Rhonda, again very tearfully, told the congregation how thankful she was, and she also said, I don't know what would have happened to me without all of your love and support, so thank you. And then after that, the room broke into applause again. As Rhonda stepped down from the pulpit, Pastor Shreves made a show of smiling really wide and winking right at Rhonda, really letting her know how special she was. And as she walked back to her pew, feeling very special, she couldn't help but wonder if any of the other women in the congregation felt just a little jealous because of her obvious close relationship to Pastor Shreves, someone that all the women really seemed to like in this church. But just then, Rhonda noticed someone unfamiliar sitting in her row. The man had a gray beard, messy hair, and he wore glasses. His clothes looked rumpled, and Rhonda noticed that he was actually the only person in the entire church who was not clapping for her. The following Sunday, Rhonda did not go to church. Instead, she was sobbing uncontrollably on the phone with a mental health counselor, saying that she was a failure and couldn't drag herself out of bed. Social workers were so worried about her that they visited Rhonda's apartment just to make sure she didn't hurt herself. When they got there, they found Rhonda in her pajamas, looking like she hadn't slept for days. The social workers really wanted her to sign up for an inpatient treatment program, but Rhonda said absolutely not. She was supposed to start work as a temporary secretary for the church on Monday, and she was not about to miss that, even if it meant giving up going into this treatment program. She had made a promise to Pastor Shreves that she would do this job, and she was not about to let him down. Rhonda knew that she was repeating a familiar pattern. Just when something good was right within reach, she would have a mental breakdown that kind of ruined it. She had always dreamed of being a teacher, but these bouts of depression and anorexia had kind of doomed her ambitions. Now she was unemployed in her 40s, and her romantic life was not much better. Rhonda was a smart and attractive person, but her relationships always fell apart. At one point, she had poured her heart out to Pastor Shreves about her history of bad boyfriends. And when she did, he put his arm around her and he reminded her that it only takes one good person. Pastor Shreves called that Sunday night to check in on Rhonda after she didn't come to church. He wanted to make sure Rhonda was okay, but he also wanted to make sure that she'd be able to work the next day. The pastor was going to be away at a conference, and so he needed someone there at the church to answer the phones. And Rhonda promised him she would be there bright and early. By Wednesday morning, so 3 days into her temporary job, Rhonda had learned the routine of her new job, but it was making her lonely. From 9 to 5 every day, Rhonda was supposed to sit in this little plain office inside of the church and just wait for the phone to ring. With Pastor Shreves gone, she was the only person in the church, so she had no one to talk to while she worked and way too much time to think about her own problems. But on this Wednesday, she did her best to cheer herself up by reminding herself that she had a date that day after work. He was a nice man that she'd met in a bipolar disorder support group, so maybe he would understand the ups and downs of her life. But right now, the end of the day when that date was going to start seemed really far off to Rhonda. Rhonda wished someone, anyone, would call just to break up the monotony of the day. Even if that call came from the very eccentric, backwards wig-wearing Mary Jane Fonder, who often called the church and seemed totally confused. In fact, Mary Jane had called the church on Rhonda's first day of work on Monday, and when Mary Jane realized that Rhonda was filling in for the receptionist, Mary Jane promptly wished Rhonda a belated happy birthday. It was not Rhonda's birthday, but she said that she appreciated Mary Jane's thoughtfulness. But then Mary Jane began asking Rhonda, "Well, why didn't you invite me to your birthday party?" Rhonda had said there was no party, but Mary Jane just did not believe her. Rhonda had finally made an excuse to get off the phone. But now, 2 days later, sitting in this room feeling so bored, left with these horrible thoughts in her head, Rhonda kind of wished Mary Jane would call. At least it was something to do. Rhonda had talked to mental health counselors 4 times in the past week as she felt herself slipping into the blackness of depression. Her parents were really worried about her. Her dad called her every morning just to hear Rhonda reassure him that she was up and at 'em. Rhonda wished that she really felt that way. At 10:55 a.m. that day, the metallic clunk of the church's side door opening broke the silence. Rhonda thought it might be Pastor Shreves, back from his conference earlier than expected, and for a moment, she was really excited. Rhonda swiveled around her chair, getting ready to greet the minister, but to her surprise, it was not Pastor Shreves. It was somebody else, and she couldn't really understand why they were there. But what surprised Rhonda even more was what this person was carrying in their hand. Two hours later, at 1 p.m., Judy Zellner, who was Rhonda's best friend at church, parked outside of Trinity Church and stepped out of her van into the crisp winter air. Judy had long ago lost her tolerance for cold days like this, and so she made a beeline for the church building. Judy fumbled for her keys, eager to get inside of the warm building. She glanced into the ground floor window of the church offices, but didn't see anybody inside. Judy was the sexton of this church, which, she would joke, was a fancy way of saying she was the cleaning lady. And on this day, that was why she was at the church, to clean it. When Judy finally found the right key and put it inside the lock, she was surprised to find the side door of the church was actually already unlocked. Springfield Township was a community of only 5,000 people with very little crime, but the policy was, on weekdays, the church doors were supposed to be locked. But regardless, Judy stepped through the door and began to peel off her coat, and as she did, she looked up and noticed the door that led into the office where Rhonda was working was open. Judy walked over and stuck her head in the door and called out hello, but nobody called back. So Judy opened the door the rest of the way and she looked into the office, but there was no one sitting behind the desk, there was nobody inside the office, and she was about to leave and go walk around the church to find where this mystery person was who had unlocked the side door, when Judy spotted something just on the side of the desk inside of this office. It was somebody's foot. Judy at first didn't even know what to do, but then instinct took over and she rushed around the desk and she looked down and she could not believe what she was seeing. There was a woman laying face down in a pool of blood that had totally saturated the carpet beneath her. The woman's long brown hair was all matted red, and the side of her face that Judy could see was totally destroyed. It was like a shattered mess of flesh and bone. But whoever this woman was, she was still breathing. Judy could see her chest rising and falling. Judy wanted to roll this person over and try to perform CPR, but she could tell the woman's injuries were just too severe for her to help. Then it dawned on Judy, whoever hurt this person could still be inside the church. And so Judy snatched the church's cordless phone off its cradle and ran outside without her coat. Standing in the parking lot, freezing cold and shaking with fear, Judy dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Judy blurted out that somebody was attacked inside of her church. Paramedics and a state trooper arrived a few minutes later, and Judy showed them to the church office where she had found the woman on the ground. And when the paramedics went in there, the woman on the ground was still alive. And so the paramedics asked Judy to leave the office while they attended to this woman, and so Judy nodded and went back outside again, but then looped around to the side of the building and looked into the office through the window. And when she did, she saw the paramedics lift the woman off the ground and roll her over onto a backboard to take her out to the ambulance. And it was at this point that Judy finally got a look at this woman, and the woman who had been hurt was her dear friend, Rhonda. 17 miles away, Pennsylvania State Trooper Greg Stumpo was eating lunch at his favorite Italian restaurant when he got a call from dispatch. A woman had been apparently shot inside of the Trinity Lutheran Church, and she was barely clinging to life, and so could Stumpo report to the scene. Since Stumpo was the senior officer on his 3-man detective team, Stumpo knew he would lead any investigation. Stumpo wolfed down the rest of his chicken parmesan and then hit the road for the church. Even though he had been a detective in rural Bucks County, Pennsylvania for almost a decade now, Stumpo really had never gotten to investigate many murders. Springfield Township itself had seen only 2 murders in the entire last 2 decades, and so Stumpo felt a big rush of adrenaline as he drove. By the time Stumpo arrived, the church was already crawling with police looking for physical evidence from the shooting. So Stumpo walked up to one of the other troopers and asked where he could find the woman who made the 911 call, Judy. The trooper immediately turned and pointed out to an idling van out in the parking lot. So Stumpo walked over and he knocked on Judy's window, which totally startled Judy. Judy had been sitting in her vehicle with the windows up, heat blasting, staring straight ahead, so shocked she couldn't even muster any tears. But she turned and looked over at Stumpo, and in his suit and tie, he did not look like a state trooper, and he very likely could tell that's what she was thinking, and so he reached down and picked up his badge and flashed it to her to show her who he was. At that point, Judy lowered down her window, but stayed in her van as she described for Stumpo what happened when she walked inside of the church. She would tell Stumpo that when she first walked into the office, the woman on the floor was so bloody and mangled that Judy didn't recognize that it was her good friend Rhonda. And Judy said at first she was positive this woman on the ground was dead, but then she realized her chest was rising and falling, and so she was still alive. Judy couldn't understand why anybody would want to hurt her friend Rhonda. Judy described Rhonda as being very sweet and shy, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She said the 2 of them had hit it off immediately when they first met, and they had become very close friends, despite the 20-year age difference between them. But Judy also told Stumpo that Rhonda had a dark side too. She struggled with bouts of depression that at times left her totally unable to function, and one time Rhonda had been so suicidal that she had to be hospitalized 5 years earlier. And Judy said, lately it seemed like Rhonda was slipping back into a depression. Stumpo was expressionless as he listened to Judy, but inside, based on what she was saying, he was beginning to wonder if maybe this was an attempted suicide rather than an attempted murder. But there was an immediate complication to that theory. Police had not recovered a weapon. If Rhonda shot herself, shouldn't the gun be right there at the scene? Maybe even still in her hand? After speaking with Judy, Stumpo went back inside the church and over to the church office where Rhonda had been found. And when he went in there, he noticed there was now a black tape outline of where Rhonda's body had been, and it was on this part of the rug that was now totally covered in blood. Stumpo got down on his hands and knees to see if maybe there was a gun under the desk or some of the other furniture nearby, but there was nothing. And then an idea occurred to Stumpo. Did someone help Rhonda shoot herself, perhaps disposing of the weapon for her afterwards? He went back outside to Judy's van and asked directly if she removed a gun from the office. Judy was totally offended at the very idea. She had been careful not to disturb anything. But while Stumpo was inside, Judy said she had thought of someone that police might want to speak with. Judy said she recalled a very unkempt-looking stranger who had come to their church earlier in January when Rhonda had stood up before the congregation, and that was the first time that Judy had ever seen this guy. Judy said that on that day, as the donation plate was passed around, she overheard the stranger say something about how this church would be a good place to rob. Judy had not taken this comment seriously, but now she wondered, did this man shoot Rhonda while he was attempting to rob the church? Stumpo took down Judy's description of this man and figured it was possible that the stranger had come back to the church to rob it. Maybe Rhonda was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Stumpo headed to his car, he asked one of the troopers to make sure they spoke to the minister and see if he could figure out if anything valuable was missing from the church. After that, Stumpo drove to St. Luke's Hospital, where paramedics had taken Rhonda. Once he was there, he found Rhonda in a private room, heavily bandaged and unconscious. Her forlorn-looking parents stood vigil at her bedside. The doctor told Stumpo before he entered that Rhonda was being kept alive by machines, and it was very unlikely that she would survive after so much brain damage and loss of blood. Rhonda's parents, Jim and Dorothy Smith, who were both in their 70s, agreed to step outside to a waiting area with Stumpo where they could all chat. Stumpo brought them coffee in styrofoam cups, and he sat down and started by saying how very sorry he was about what had happened. Then Rhonda's father, Jim, told Stumpo about Rhonda's long struggle with bipolar disorder and the many times their daughter had flirted with suicide. Jim said he would never let Rhonda keep a gun around her apartment, and he would never keep one at his own house. Luckily, Jim added, the one time Rhonda had tried shooting a gun, she had hated it. And so Jim told Stumpo that he thought it was very unlikely that Rhonda would ever shoot herself. Jim told Stumpo that he and his wife Dorothy had not actually seen their daughter earlier that day. However, they had spoken to her around 8:30 a.m., and she sounded like she was in a good mood. Then again, Jim said, because of Rhonda's condition, her moods could sometimes change on a dime. 4 hours after that conversation, so at about 12:30 p.m., Jim and Dorothy had driven past the church on their way to lunch, and they saw Rhonda's car in the parking lot. The parents talked about stopping by and taking their daughter out for a bite, but they figured Rhonda was busy. Employment had been scarce for Rhonda, so they continued past the church and wound up eating lunch without her. The detective listened carefully and very sympathetically, but internally, he didn't get the feeling that these parents were going to actually offer up any information that could actually help investigators. But at the end of the conversation, Jim said something somewhat off the cuff to Stumpo that made Stumpo pause. Jim said that he prayed his daughter had not tried to kill herself. He and his wife were very religious, and they believed anybody who even attempted suicide faced eternal damnation, and so they couldn't bear such a fate for their beloved child. As the parents got up to leave, Jim told Stumpo that he really hoped investigators would not find a gun at the church. Jim's parting remark left Stumpo wondering whether they were telling the truth when they said they did not stop at the church on the way to lunch. Maybe, he thought, they walked into the church only to find their daughter lying on the floor from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The parents could have mistakenly believed their daughter was already dead, and maybe they took the weapon from the scene so it didn't look like a suicide. Stumpo knew this idea was a total long shot, but it was too early to rule out anything. Just as Stumpo was about to walk out the front door of the hospital, he spotted a tall, middle-aged man with a priest collar in the hospital lobby. The man dabbed at his eyes and composed himself before pressing the elevator button. Stumpo walked over to him and asked the man if he was Pastor Shreves from Trinity Lutheran. Shreves nodded and said he was on his way up to minister to Rhonda's family. Stumpo asked him if he wouldn't mind speaking to him for a couple of minutes, and Pastor Shreves agreed. Shreves was so anxious to get up to Rhonda's bedside that he could barely sit still while the two men talked. Shreves said, he blamed himself for what happened because he had not been at the church to protect Rhonda. The pastor admitted that he really didn't know what he was going to say to Rhonda's parents when he got up there, or what he was going to say to the congregation. Despite his age, Shreves had only just graduated from the seminary 3 years earlier. Before that, he was competing in golf tournaments, and so nothing in his limited experience as a minister had prepared him for something like this. The pastor also said he didn't know Rhonda all that well, and he couldn't remember when she actually first joined the congregation. He described her as a very quiet, lonely young woman who had struggled with mental health issues. Stumpo sized up the minister as he spoke. The man was very handsome, as Judy had mentioned to Stumpo, but what really stood out to Stumpo was not this guy's good looks, but the fact that he did not see Rhonda as a close friend. He actually said, he was not that close with her. Judy had told Stumpo that Rhonda saw the pastor as a very dear friend and mentor. And so to Stumpo, it seemed very clear that Rhonda and Pastor Shreves' relationship was very imbalanced. However, Pastor Shreves did know enough about Rhonda to suggest to Stumpo that he really should look into Rhonda's troubled love life. Shreves said that Rhonda had told him at one point that she had been in a very abusive relationship a few years ago, and things had actually gotten so bad that Rhonda sought the help of a domestic abuse center. Shreves said he didn't know who this ex-boyfriend was, but it was clear to him that their relationship still weighed on Rhonda years after they parted ways. Pastor Shreves told Stumpo that Rhonda also had a more recent breakup with a man she had met online who lived in Philadelphia. Shreves said that as far as he knew, Rhonda and this guy had gone on a few dates, but then at some point the guy had stopped returning Rhonda's calls, and that had left Rhonda feeling very sad and very wounded. Shortly after this, Stumpo and Shreves wrapped up their conversation, and Stumpo headed out the door. And as Stumpo left the hospital, his head was spinning. He had only been investigating the shooting of Rhonda Smith for a few hours, but he already had an array of theories. Did she shoot herself? Was she caught up in an armed robbery? Was she a victim of an abusive former boyfriend? He couldn't prove or disprove any of these. 2 hours later, around 6 p.m., Stumpo got a phone call from another detective, and they told him that Rhonda Smith was dead. Her parents had asked the doctors to take her off life support when it became clear she had absolutely no brain activity. And so the case now was no longer an attempted suicide or murder, it simply was a suicide or a murder. Rhonda was supposed to go on a date on the night that she died, and so Stumpo wasted no time figuring that out and then tracking the date down. The man's name was Gregory Danisavage, and Stumpo found him at his house just before 8 p.m., and he was still dressed in slacks and a blazer for his date that would never happen. Gregory said he was supposed to pick up Rhonda at her apartment at 6 p.m., but she didn't show, and she didn't send him a message to explain. And so he had sat outside in his car for a while, and then finally just went home, hoping that nothing had happened to her. Unfortunately, Stumpo said, something had happened to her, but he wouldn't provide any details. Stumpo asked where Gregory had been late on Wednesday morning, and he had a ready answer. He said he was taking care of his mother as she recovered from surgery. Now seeming a bit nervous, Gregory told Stumpo that the last guy Rhonda had been dating might have wanted to harm her. And so he said, Rhonda feared that that guy was just using her for sex, and so she had tried to slow the relationship down. But when she did that, the guy basically stopped calling her, at which point Rhonda began calling him, but he never picked up. Stumpo thanked Gregory for the tip, and then he left. However, when Stumpo followed up on Gregory's tip about this previous guy who Rhonda had been seeing, who apparently was just using her for sex, well, Stumpo quickly determined that it was a total dead end. The guy's name was Ray Finkel, and he would tell Stumpo that he had only gone on 4 dates with Rhonda, and he had stopped calling her really just because her house was too far away. Finkel said he was working all day Wednesday, the day that Rhonda was killed, and he had the security card check-in to prove it. As Stumpo ended the call with Ray Finkel, he was thinking that neither Gregory nor Ray even knew Rhonda well enough to want her dead. These were not exactly torrid love affairs. However, the abusive ex-boyfriend that Pastor Shreves had warned about turned out to be a much darker story. A social worker at the domestic abuse center that Rhonda had called said that Rhonda had accused this man of sexually assaulting her 4 years ago and getting her pregnant. Rhonda eventually got an abortion, but the social worker said that Rhonda was haunted by the experience. Then the social worker said that as part of Rhonda's therapy, she kept a journal of her relationship with her abuser. And so the social worker told Stumpo that maybe that journal would give investigators the information that they needed. Rhonda's parents gave Stumpo the spare key to their daughter's apartment. And then when Stumpo went into the apartment, inside of a desk drawer, he found all these yellow legal pads that were filled with Rhonda's writing. And the writing included all the intimate details of her past relationship with this man who had hurt her so badly. They painted a picture of a very unhappy romance, one that continued even after she accused this man of abuse. But Rhonda indicated in her more recent entries that she had not had any contact with this guy for 2 whole years. And so this abusive boyfriend really seemed like a bad person, but he didn't really fit the profile of Rhonda's murderer because he had not interacted with her in years. And so Stumpo now understood why people said Rhonda was unlucky in love, but so far, nothing in her past seemed to add up to a motive for murder. While Stumpo tracked down the rest of Rhonda's boyfriends, other members of his team began to look into that strange newcomer to the church, the kind of disheveled-looking guy who Judy had overheard say, Trinity Lutheran would be a good place to rob. Well, despite having a great description of this guy within 24 hours of the shooting, he was about 5'10", he wore wire-rimmed glasses and had scraggly salt and pepper hair. Despite having this description, none of the state databases of criminals and people on parole or probation contained anyone who looked like this stranger. Now, of course, Stumpo didn't just rule him out as a potential suspect simply because he couldn't find him. However, at the same time, the whole robbery idea just seemed kind of unlikely to Stumpo. Pastor Shreves had told Stumpo that the church rarely had any cash inside, and the pastor actually looked all around the church and couldn't find anything missing following the shooting. So if Rhonda really was the victim of a robbery gone bad, then why wasn't anything stolen? And so 2 days into this investigation, and Stumpo had almost nothing to show for all his effort. He wasn't even sure if he was investigating a murder or a suicide. A few days later, on Monday afternoon, January 28th, so 5 days after the murder, Stumpo sat in the balcony of the church as Pastor Shreves led Rhonda's memorial service below. More than 250 people had packed into the church to show their love for Rhonda. Stumpo looked down and saw Rhonda's parents sitting in the front row, and as he did, he considered the possibility that, the parents had covered up their daughter's suicide. It seemed extremely unlikely, but it was still possible. Then Stumpo scanned around the rest of the teary-eyed parishioners and thought to himself, if Rhonda did not kill herself, then the culprit was probably in this room. After the service ended, Stumpo waited for the crowd to thin, then he asked Pastor Shreves if he had a few minutes. Shreves walked Stumpo out of the church and across the parking lot to the small ranch house where he lived. As they reached his porch, Stumpo noticed an apple pie sitting in front of the side door to the house, but Pastor Shreves was not happy about this pie. As soon as he read the note that was sitting on top of the pie, Shreves expressed his irritation. He explained to Stumpo that one of the members of the church would often leave food for him, even though he had asked her to stop. Stumpo asked Shreves who this woman was, and Shreves would say her name was Mary Jane. The same Mary Jane who was very eccentric and wore her wigs backwards, and at one point had actually baked a pie for Rhonda. Shreves would say, Mary Jane was a member of the church's choir and she was a talented artist whose paintings hung on the walls of the church. But he said, I think she has a crush on me. And as the pastor talked, Stumpo remembered how people at the church said there was like this running joke that, Pastor Shreves was single and handsome, and basically all the women who went to this church had crushes on him, and some of them liked to bring him unsolicited gifts like food. And so Stumpo was pretty sure that Rhonda Smith must be one of these admirers, just like Mary Jane was. And, that was probably why their relationship seemed so imbalanced, with Rhonda looking at the pastor as this mentor and close friend, and the pastor basically being like, yeah, I know Rhonda, she's nice, but that's about it. Over the next few days, the events on the morning of the shooting became increasingly clear as investigators talked to more people and collected records. On the day Rhonda died, she had called a mental health crisis line from the church just after 10 a.m., saying she felt suicidal. Then at 10:55, she stopped using the church internet service, suggesting she was either shot right before then or right after that point. And so in Stumpo's mind, it was easy to imagine a desperate, lonely person making one last call for help before just ending it all. But then, on January 30th, Stumpo received the autopsy report. Sitting at his desk in the police barracks 15 miles from Springfield Township, Stumpo marveled at what he read in the report. It didn't solve the case by any means, but it did make one thing clear. This was no suicide. The medical examiner found that Rhonda had been shot twice. The first bullet glanced off her forehead, while the second round penetrated her skull. What's more, the shots were fired from 3 or 4 feet away, suggesting that the shooter was on the other side of the desk from Rhonda. The coroner said Rhonda's head had none of the tiny burn marks that are associated with shots fired at extremely close range, like a suicide gunshot would be. And so Stumpo concluded that, while Rhonda may have been depressed, she certainly did not pull the trigger to end her own life. She was definitely murdered. About a week later, on the evening of February 6th, Stumpo and another investigator named Bob Egan arrived at Trinity Lutheran Church just before 7 p.m. when choir practice was about to begin. One of the few members of the church community they had not spoken with yet was Mary Jane Fonder, though they had heard a lot about her. Mostly that she was very eccentric, wore her wig backwards sometimes, and periodically dropped off pies for the pastor and for Rhonda. And so Stumpo and the other investigator walked into the church, and right away they spotted Mary Jane along with the other members of the choir getting ready to start their practice, and the investigators flagged Mary Jane and asked her to come with them so they could talk to her in a side room. But as they were walking over to this room, Mary Jane said to them that she had actually been meaning to reach out to them because she had spoken to Rhonda a couple of days before she was killed. Mary Jane said she had called into the church and was surprised when Rhonda answered and not the normal secretary. But Mary Jane said she had actually just taken the time to talk to Rhonda because Mary Jane had been worried about Rhonda's state of mind, like many other people in the church were. And so Mary Jane told the investigators that Rhonda apparently had such a crush on Pastor Shreves that at least to Mary Jane, it seemed like it was clouding her judgment. And the example that Mary Jane gave to show this was she said the minister had organized a birthday party for Rhonda just before her death, and Rhonda had not invited Mary Jane to attend, even though in Mary Jane's eyes, they were close friends. And so it just seemed like Rhonda was being weirdly protective of Pastor Shreves and didn't want other women there. Mary Jane would also tell the investigators that she was just too upset to even attend Rhonda's memorial service, but she had baked a pie for Rhonda's parents and visited with them after the service. Then Detective Egan asked Mary Jane point blank, did she own a gun? And Mary Jane kind of laughed and said no, and she wouldn't even know how to use one. So the detectives thanked Mary Jane for her time, and then she turned and headed back over to choir practice, and the detectives walked out of the church feeling like they were no closer to solving this crime. But having now met Mary Jane, she seemed less like this totally eccentric, weird person that people had made her out to be, and more just like a very harmless old lady. The following day, February 7th, Stumpo learned that the state police were reassigning the other two detectives in his unit to other cases that weren't even murders. Stumpo knew what that meant. His bosses were losing confidence in his investigation because he was not making enough progress. And so now the Rhonda murder investigation was down to just him and Detective Egan, who was on loan from headquarters. And as weeks passed by, still with no breakthrough, Stumpo began to worry that they might never solve this crime. But Detective Egan, who was a veteran homicide investigator, kept saying that you never know when a hot tip will come in the door. And that's exactly what happened on a cold and windy morning on Saturday, March 29th, nearly 9 weeks after Rhonda's murder. 6 miles from Trinity Lutheran Church, a man and his 8-year-old son were fishing in Lake Nakamixon under the bridge that runs across it. At some point, the boy noticed something shiny in the muddy, shallow water at the lake's edge. He pulled what looked like a toy gun out of the water and showed off his trophy to his dad. But when the boy's father took a look, he realized his son was not holding a toy, it was a real gun. The father snatched the revolver from the boy's hands and immediately popped open the cylinder and shook the weapon to make sure it was not loaded. 3 live rounds fell into the mud, plus the casing from a bullet which had already been fired. The boy's father called the state police barracks where Stumpo worked to report that his son had found a loaded gun in the lake, and the man wondered what he should do with it. The trooper who answered this phone call, whose name was Andrew Mincer, had been the first police officer on the scene at the Rhonda Smith shooting, and he immediately thought of the missing weapon from that crime. Mincer asked the father for the serial number on the gun, and after he got it, he told the father to hang onto the gun and give it to nobody else until he, Mincer, could get there to pick it up. As soon as Mincer hung up the phone, he ran the serial number through the National Crime Information Center, and in minutes, he learned who the Rossi .38 revolver was registered to. Stumpo was in the police barracks when this call came in, but he was down in the locker room thinking about how little time he had spent with his 5-year-old son lately. Police work was literally taking over Stumpo's life, and he had so little to show for it. Stumpo was about to head home when his cell phone rang. The call was coming from within the station he was standing in, and so Stumpo sighed at the thought of even more police work to do. But the instant Stumpo answered, Mincer, who was very excited, told him that a little boy who had been fishing out in Lake Nakamixon had just found a .38 caliber revolver, just like the one that had been fired at Rhonda Smith. Mincer said the gun was purchased in 1994, 14 years before Rhonda's murder. But despite being a bit old and having been in the water, it still appeared to be in working condition. And so Stumpo suddenly felt totally energized, and he couldn't help but think, this sounds like we have just found the murder weapon. The next day was a Sunday, but the ballistics expert at the state trooper barracks happened to be in the crime lab that day working on another case. Stumpo convinced him to drop what he was doing and test the gun the boy found in the lake against the slug that the coroner pulled from Rhonda. And the test proved the revolver found in the lake was the one that killed Rhonda. The next day, Detective Stumpo and Egan visited the address associated with the original owner of the gun. And the property they went to was this rundown cabin at the end of a long driveway sitting on 11 acres of woods. Stumpo and Egan knew that this address was probably an important break in the case, but it didn't mean the original owner of this gun was definitely Rhonda's killer. It had been 14 years since this revolver was purchased, so plenty of time for the gun to change hands may be off the books. After Stumpo knocked, an old man wearing a dress shirt and a plastic pocket protector opened the door just a crack and peered out very suspiciously at the detectives. Egan asked if it would be okay if they came inside and spoke to him, and the man very reluctantly opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside to let them come in. Stumpo and Egan were appalled by what they saw inside. The house was a hoarder's den. Junk-filled boxes and papers piled high and covered with cobwebs and bird droppings. The entire place just totally reeked, to the point where both detectives were breathing through their mouths just so they didn't have to smell the air. Now, the police knew this man was not the original owner of the gun. It was actually his sister who lived with him. And so the detectives asked him if his sister was home, but the man said she wasn't. So the detectives asked him if he knew that his sister had at one point purchased a .38 revolver. The man said that his sister had trouble with a coworker several years back and felt kind of threatened, so she had bought a gun. But she only shot it once in the yard for practice, and the noise was apparently too much for her. Her brother said that she had thrown the gun away years ago, and he didn't know where she threw it away, and he had never seen it or heard about it again. But Stumpo and Egan were not fully convinced about the story. They told the brother that the gun had just been pulled out of the lake. If the gun had been tossed into the water in 1994, shortly after his sister bought it, then by now it would be totally covered in rust. But the gun had no rust on it, which indicated it had not been in the lake for more than a few weeks. The brother fell quiet for a moment, and then told the investigators that he did have something to show them. He took them outside to his car, and he lifted the driver's floor mat to reveal something which shocked the two investigators, and it confirmed that they were on the right track. The old man showed the detectives shiny pieces of metal that were underneath the floor mat of his car, and the detectives immediately recognized these fragments as being part of a bullet casing. Now, when that boy had found the gun in the lake, it had contained 3 live rounds and 1 spent shell casing. However, investigators knew that Rhonda had been shot twice, so there needed to be 2 spent shell casings. And so far, all they could account for was that one that the boy found in the gun. And now, these fragments on the floor of the car could be, potentially, pieces of that other spent round. At last, Stumpo finally had his primary suspect. It was this old man's sister, the original owner of this gun. And that afternoon, police were able to arrest her right as she left the Trinity Lutheran Church, driving her brother's car. The same car that police had just found those fragments from the shell casing underneath the floor mat. Also, after they made this arrest, police searched the inside of the car, and they found a calendar with January 23rd circled, the day Rhonda was murdered, and over that date on the calendar were the words, Rhonda murdered. Based on Stumpo and Egan's investigation, here is what really happened on January 23rd, the day Rhonda was murdered. At 10:30 a.m. on January 23rd, the killer slipped into her brother's car and drove to Trinity Lutheran Church. She pulled into the parking lot, and as she did, she looked over at the first-floor office window, and she saw Rhonda sitting inside. The killer got out of the car, walked up to the side door of the church, they unlocked it, and went inside. Once inside, the killer looked around the building and determined that Rhonda was the only person inside. The killer then walked over to the church office where Rhonda was. She went inside, and as soon as she did, Rhonda's face lit up with recognition and a smile, until Rhonda noticed the revolver in the killer's hand. Seconds later, the killer raised the gun, aimed it at Rhonda, and fired. The shot struck Rhonda right in the forehead, knocking her off her chair and onto the floor. The killer rushed around the desk and stood over Rhonda, and right away they noticed the bullet had only grazed Rhonda's forehead. And so with Rhonda writhing in pain on the carpet, the killer backed up a couple of feet and then raised their gun again, aimed it at the side of Rhonda's head, and fired. And this time, the bullet went right into Rhonda's head. Satisfied that Rhonda was now dead, the killer casually left the church and drove to a hair appointment. After the detectives questioned her in connection with the murder, the killer got nervous and decided to get rid of the gun. So the killer borrowed her brother's car, drove 6 miles to that bridge that crossed over Lake Nakamixon, and the killer tossed the gun out the window without even stopping. And then, a month later, the boy and his father would find the gun. It would turn out the original owner of the gun and Rhonda's murderer was none other than the eccentric, backwards wig-wearing, apple pie-making Mary Jane Fonder. Mary Jane did not see Rhonda as a desperately lonely, depressed person on the brink of suicide. Instead, she saw Rhonda as this pretty young thing who was competing with her, Mary Jane, for the affection and love of Pastor Shreves. Mary Jane was convinced that Rhonda and the pastor were having this romantic love affair, even though they totally were not. In Mary Jane's mind, she believed that she and Pastor Shreves had this undeniable chemistry, and they were meant to be together. And she was sure he felt the same way, even though he repeatedly asked her to stop calling him and to basically leave him alone. The last straw for Mary Jane had been when the pastor had raised money to help Rhonda out, and then got the whole congregation to clap and applaud for her when she was up there speaking. No one ever helped out Mary Jane when she lost her job and needed money, and Mary Jane had been a member of the church for 14 years. Compared to her, Rhonda was a newcomer. So Mary Jane killed Rhonda out of spite and jealousy, and with the hope that once Rhonda was out of the way, Mary Jane would have the pastor all to herself. All of this was obviously delusional, but Mary Jane believed it. And it would turn out this wasn't the first time Mary Jane was connected to a suspicious death. Back in 1993, her 83-year-old father disappeared. Mary Jane, who was his caretaker, claimed that he walked out of the house and never came home. Now, at the time, police did suspect that Mary Jane had killed her father and either completely destroyed his body or managed to hide it really well. And Mary Jane, she remained under suspicion for this death, but police could never prove it. In the end, Mary Jane would be convicted of murdering Rhonda, and she would be sentenced to life in prison. However, she would die in prison only 10 years into her sentence. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time. Hey, Prime members, you can binge 8 new episodes of the MrBallen podcast 1 month early and all episodes ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today. And before you go, please tell us about yourself by completing